For nearly 20 years, the British and French navies would be locked in a struggle of epic proportions during both the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The strategies that shaped these titanic conflicts would find their roots before the French Revolution even began, however. France and Britain were enemies long before the start of the Revolution, fighting numerous wars on both land and sea. As part of that competition between two of the strongest European powers, both countries' navies played prominent roles. After their defeat in the 7 Years' War, France was eager to get back at Britain, and so invested heavily in their navy in the following decades. That investment would bear fruit, as during the American Revolution, France was able to provide crucial naval support to the 13 colonies, winning several important naval victories. War is expensive, however, especially when one invests heavily into one's navy, building large and costly warships. Following British defeat in the American Revolution, Britain would increase its own investment into its navy, with France finding itself essentially in a naval arms race. Britain is an island and had an extensive overseas empire that required not only a large navy to protect it, but also a massive maritime fleet to conduct trade. It could therefore justify huge investments into its navy as a way to ensure security for trade and the country as a whole. France, on the other hand, was a land power that neither benefited to the same degree to investments in its navy or could afford to invest as many resources into it. Nevertheless, France would invest massively into its expanding navy, putting further strain on its already stretched coffers. When the French Revolution began, the British had the stronger navy, with the French coming in a respectable second place, with enough ships to seriously challenge any attempt at British naval dominance. On the eve of the French Revolution, France had roughly 60 ships of the line and another 60 frigates, with various smaller vessels giving them a total force of nearly 300 ships, on paper at least. In comparison, the British had roughly 650 ships in its own navy, with about 100 being ships of the line and the rest being frigates or smaller vessels of various sizes. What existed on paper, however, did not necessarily correlate to what was actually battle-ready at any given time. Many British ships were not in active service, with the proportion of smaller French and in particular British ships making the advantage of the British in terms of sheer numbers appear larger than it actually was. The French Revolution took the navy that it had inherited from the old regime and proceeded to gut its personnel. Royalist officers in both the army and the navy were the majority, but nobles in the navy especially prevented anyone without a high enough noble background from becoming officers. It was so bad that attempts to increase the number of officers by the old regime to meet its naval expansion goals ended up in failure, as the position of the nobility was just too entrenched. As a result, the officer ranks of the Navy were drastically reduced, as the vast majority of officers were either killed, retired, or forced to flee the country. To replace the lost officers, the Republic mass promoted from the naval ranks anyone who appeared even slightly competent. The result was poor officers and ship crews that now lacked the backbone of skilled sailors that a warship required to function optimally. This lack of officers and crew would prove detrimental to the Republic's war efforts when it declared war preemptively on Britain in 1793. By declaring war themselves, the revolutionary government hoped to launch a surprise naval campaign against British shipping. Lacking officers and ready crews, the campaign was delayed for over a month, giving Britain critical time to ready its own navy. Generally, the French were able to mobilize a significant number of ships to face the British, but they struggled to mass the ships into a large enough force for action. Instead, smaller squadrons or lone frigates were sent out to harass trade. When they did manage to concentrate forces for larger operations, the British were often able to counter the force with a fleet of equal or larger size. With French ships lacking skilled officers and veteran sailors, the British often got the upper hand in battles thanks to their skilled crews and capable officers. When the French Revolution kicked off, the British were not immediately ready to wage war on the high seas. Maintaining a large fleet was expensive, with constant maintenance being required to keep ships in fighting shape, and thousands of men needed to crew them. To cut costs, the British government did not fully man the fleet at all times, with many sailors instead finding work on merchant ships. As war with France appeared more and more likely, and especially after the French declared war, the Admiralty rushed to fill out its ships with crew. The time that the French took to ready its own ships for war provided the critically needed time for the British to fully get on war footing. Manpower would be a constant issue for the British Navy as new ships were added to the fleet. In addition to newly constructed ships back in Britain, captured enemy vessels were often added to the fleet, leading to an ever-expanding need for manpower. Since the British relied on trade, however, sailors could not be taken from maritime shipping, and in fact, eventually maritime trade would increase, requiring even more sailors. Eventually, nearly 3% of Britain's male population, some 150,000 men, would be serving in the Navy by the end of the Napoleonic Wars. At the start of the Revolutionary Wars, however, the Navy had less than 17,000 men in its service. One priority ruled over all others in the view of the British Navy: preventing an invasion of the home isles. As long as the invading army could not reach Britain, then the war could be carried on, and the British army could confront France at a place of its own choosing. Secondly, the Navy aimed to keep the French fleet balled up in its ports, so it could not concentrate its forces or seriously threaten maritime trade. Lastly, under no circumstances could France be allowed to accumulate enough ships to threaten British numerical superiority at sea. These objectives were all met more or less during the course of the Revolutionary Wars, but the conflict during this period was often very fluid. An early blow to the French Navy would come with the capture of Toulon in August 1793. Toulon was the main naval base in the Mediterranean, and its capture included essentially the entire French Mediterranean fleet. Even with the city being recaptured in only 3 months, many of the ships were lost as the retreating British-Spanish force set fire to the fleet. Though it could have been much worse, as the hasty nature of the retreat and failure of the Spanish to properly set fire to their assigned ships meant that only half the fleet was lost. Nearly 15 ships of the line were either scuttled in the harbor or captured, with over 10 smaller frigates or corvettes also being lost. Another 14 ships of the line would survive the siege and return to French service, allowing the Mediterranean fleet to still pose at least some threat. The first significant action between the two navies would take place on the 1st of June, 1794. A large grain convoy from America was being guarded by the French Atlantic Fleet as it made its way for France, carrying greatly needed food. The British attempted to intercept the French fleet and capture or destroy the grain convoy. Both sides had been raiding each other's merchant ships for some time, and 2 indecisive fleet actions would take place before the two fleets, totaling over 25 ships of the line each, fully engaged with each other. The battle would maul both fleets, with the French gaining the worst of it, losing 7 ships of the line, with the British losing none. Both fleets were forced to retreat, however, to repair, and the grain convoy would reach France safely. Each side may have claimed victory, but the losses suffered by the French foreshadowed the ever-worsening losses that would be suffered whenever confronting the British at sea. The failed attempt at invading Ireland in 1796, Battle of the Nile, and other naval engagements would see France lose dozens of ships, with many being captured and added to the British Navy. All France had to show in return was a few token victories that had no major impact on the war at sea as a whole. At most, it can be said that the British were kept busy, more often than not forced to react to French actions, rather than going on the offensive themselves. It's hard to call that success, however, when it played into the British goal of keeping France contained as much as possible. After repeated losses at sea, it was clear that the French Navy, in as poor a state as it was, and with as many losses as it had taken, it could not hope to challenge the British Navy alone. Luckily for them, repeated victories on land against the rest of Europe meant that the French Navy did not necessarily have to fight alone. There were 3 other navies of significant size in Europe that, if combined with the remaining French fleet, could pose a serious threat to the British. The Dutch, Spanish, and Danish all had notable fleets, and at one point or another would see themselves drawn into the war on the side of the French. A French invasion of the Netherlands in 1794 led to the founding of the Batavian Republic, the first sister republic established by France during the Revolutionary Wars. Thanks to the establishment of the Batavian Republic, the Dutch fleet was now allied to France. In 1795, the Spanish would lead the first coalition against France, and in 1796 allied with the French, contributing its fleet to the war. The entrance of the Spanish fleet into the war on the side of France was actually seen as such a threat to the British that they pulled their navy out of the Mediterranean for a time. Unfortunately for France, even with the addition of two Allied fleets, they still faced one of the critical problems that they had faced since the start of hostilities with their own navy. The ships were not concentrated, and individually could be defeated by the British. In 1797, a concentration of the fleets was attempted, as both Batavian and Spanish fleets set sail for the French port of Brest. Neither would succeed in making the journey. The Spanish fleet of 25 ships of the line and accompanying support ships encountered and were defeated by a British fleet half their size. 4 ships of the line would be captured by the British, with the rest of the fleet forced to return to Spain. While the defeat prevented the Spanish from linking with the French, they did not lose the majority of their ships. The same could not be said for the Batavian effort. When the Batavian fleet of 15 ships of the line and accompanying frigates left to link with the other fleets, they quickly ran into a British force of equal size. During the ensuing battle, the Batavians put up a much tougher fight than the Spanish, inflicting a not insignificant amount of damage to their British opponents. Even so, they would still lose the battle, with nearly 2/3 of the fleet being captured by the British, what remained being forced to limp back to port. These dual defeats would end the hopes of France to seriously challenge the British for some time. Not resting on their victories, Britain would continue to ensure that no force could challenge British naval or trade supremacy. The creation of a League of Armed Neutrality in 1800 by Denmark-Norway, Russia, Prussia, and Sweden was viewed as a threat to both, leading to a preemptive attack on the Danish fleet located at Copenhagen in 1801. In the ensuing battle that lasted 6 hours, both sides lined up and fired savage long-range broadsides against each other in a test of endurance and gunnery. By the time both sides stopped firing, over 1,200 British were dead or wounded, but all Danish forces had been compelled to surrender with heavy losses. The Danes lost 9 ships of the line to 0 on the British side and were forced to leave the League of Neutrality, with the League collapsing not long after. British naval superiority was unmatched, but the French likewise had won the wars of the First and Second Coalition on the continent. Britain was isolated and did not desire a prolonged war against an opponent that neither side appeared able to defeat easily. And so both sides would make peace in 1802 with the Treaty of Amiens. Neither side put great faith in the peace lasting, however, and so it would serve more as a chance for both sides to prepare for the renewal of hostilities. It also provides a chance to look at the foundations of the strategies that both sides operated under. Warships during this period were expensive and difficult to make. Once made, they had to be maintained and kept in good shape constantly, or risk a ship not being ready for service when it was needed. If you had a warship in proper shape, then you needed an experienced crew to man it, and when it inevitably got damaged in battle, you needed to be able to replace all of the above. The true strength of the British Navy in comparison to the French is that they managed to maintain the resources required for constant action and expansion of their fleet. Construction of ships took up a large amount of trees, with specific high-quality trees required for parts of a ship such as the mast. Britain was able to source wood from a multitude of places thanks to its overseas colonial empire. France, meanwhile, had gone through much of its own domestic supplies in the naval buildup preceding the Revolution. Wood had to be imported from the rest of Europe. Other needed parts of a ship, such as rope, sails, and even the copper to protect the hull from sea life, required complex logistical networks. The British ranged far and wide, needing constant supplies to repair and maintain their ships. Thankfully, their naval dominance allowed for these supplies to flow freely, unlike the French, who faced much greater difficulties in securing supplies. Wood, for masts especially, could not be transported over land, forcing the French to transport by river and canal or by sea. Napoleon's victories on the continent allowed for him to go to the great lengths to secure the wood he needed to construct ships, over time creating a system that reduced the chance of British intercept as much as possible. Even so, many resources were intercepted when necessity forced their transport by sea, until Napoleon was able to create a more secure logistical network. Attrition on the French fleet was less of an issue thanks to them more rarely leaving port, reducing the resources needed to maintain them. At the same time, the fact that French ships did not often sail led to another problem. If the British were struggling to fully man both their navy and maritime trade empire, then the French struggled to find sailors that could man the few ships they did have due to lack of training. One of the greatest benefits of the peace at Amiens was that about 30,000 captured French sailors, being held by Britain, were returned to France. These returning, experienced sailors provided Napoleon a large backbone to staff his new ships with, as he attempted to rebuild the French navy. Even so, he greatly lacked experienced sailors and officers, and so he worked to rectify that by creating a system that would help solve his logistics and manpower problems at the same time. Whenever possible, trees and other resources were transported by either canal or river, but when that proved impossible, then traveling along the French coast, close enough to shore where British warships could not easily reach, was the best option. To protect France's coastal trade routes, he created a large number of land batteries and created a coast guard. Sailors could get at least some experience before being then sent to serve in the navy. A few limited voyages of smaller ships also allowed for at least part of the crews to get valuable experience. Through these means, Napoleon gradually was able to build up his fleet. The British at the same time were dealing with issues related to their sheer size of their navy. Having such a massive navy required huge amounts of sailors to man the ships, and enough docks to not only service the fleet, but build new ships as well. Manpower was solved through three ways: encouraging volunteers through better pay, forced impressment to fill out the ranks, and a quota system that required parts of Britain to provide a certain number of men for the navy based on population. Volunteers were treated the best in the Royal Navy and were perceived as better sailors when compared to the other two groups. Press ganging exploded in practice during the period due to the vast need for sailors, to the point that it was part of the reason the War of 1812 with America broke out. Those impressed were at times, however, given the opportunity to volunteer and receive better treatment. The quota system was introduced in 1795 and was not without issues, as the better off were able to pay for others to serve when a quota was struggling to be met. Though strained at times, the British were able to secure sailors in the numbers required to man both their navy and merchant fleet. From 1796 to 1801, the British invested heavily in not only refurbishing their existing docks, but also building new ones. By the time the Napoleonic Wars started, enough capacity had been built up to meet Britain's needs. Further investment would continue for the duration of the Napoleonic Wars to one level or another. Napoleon's France, too, invested in their docks, but had a much more limited number of ports, which increased over time with the conquest of Europe. One last important difference between the fleets of Europe is how they were trained to fight. While sailing and tactics were often similar between nations, the way each nation's crews were trained to target their cannons were different. French and Spanish crews were trained to aim high, aiming to disable ships by hitting their rigging, sails, or masts. The enemy could then be engaged at one's leisure, or even be left behind as the battle raged elsewhere. Meanwhile, the British, and interestingly the Dutch, aimed low, targeting their opponent's hulls to inflict maximum damage. By targeting the hull, the enemy's crew and guns would be taking the brunt of damage in battle, reducing the opponent's firepower in addition to greatly hurting the crew's morale. Combine the inexperience of many French crews along with the morale shock experienced in battle by British tactics, and it goes some way to explaining why French ships so often surrendered in battle. The renewal of hostilities between France and Britain in 1803 meant that the war at sea was back on. In truth, the British by this time had worn down the French fleet to a considerable degree, but if the French and Spanish could combine their fleets, there still remained a hope that something could be done about British naval dominance. That hope would materialize in the combined Franco-Spanish naval force that faced the British in 1805 at the Battle of Trafalgar. Through great effort, what remained of the French Mediterranean fleet managed to combine with the Spanish fleet, all the while being chased by the British under Nelson. The combined fleet sailed to the West Indies before swinging back around to meet up with another French fleet at Brest to clear the English Channel of British warships so an invasion of England could take place. Before the second linking of the fleets could take place, however, Nelson finally caught the French and Spanish and would do battle even while outnumbered. Combined, the Franco-Spanish fleet numbered 33 ships of the line versus the British 27. With daring tactics and superior skill, Nelson would win the battle, capturing or destroying 17 enemy ships, with none lost on the British side. Nelson would not survive the battle, but his victory would convince Napoleon to give up on an invasion of Britain. For the rest of the Napoleonic Wars, France would be kept under close blockade, but this did not completely end Napoleon's naval ambitions. Slowly but surely, the French Empire worked to build up its fleet, pouring in resources gained from its victories on the continent. With every new ship built, the blockade of France had to be reinforced with more ships. Forcing Britain to spend more on its blockade actually played into Napoleon's continental system, as it put further economic strain on the British government. Napoleon aimed to build a fleet of 100 ships of the line to challenge the British, but it kept being delayed by events on the continent. Part of the motivation for seizing control of Spain was to secure the naval resources that Napoleon felt were not being fully invested in the war. Instead of increasing France's naval capacity, his actions created a long-lasting war that sapped resources from his empire. The War of the Fifth Coalition against the Austrians as well required the diversion of resources. Finally, Napoleon aimed to have his fleet of 100 warships ready in 1812. Instead, he would make his greatest military blunder as his invasion of Russia that year turned into a disaster. Even after his defeat in Russia, Napoleon resisted diverting more resources from his navy. He was particularly unwilling to strip it of the tens of thousands of conscripts that were allocated to it. Should those men be lost in battle, they would be time-consuming to replace. As the situation grew more dire, he eventually began turning to the Navy and Coast Guard to provide more men for the army, especially after his defeat at Leipzig. Napoleon's navy would number about 80 ships of the line by the time of his first abdication, but it would never sally forth against the British in great numbers. The war at sea between the British and French lasted for 20 years in one form or another. Britain may have had the upper hand for the duration of this struggle, but it did not go unchallenged at multiple points. It was both a military and economic war, a contest between logistical systems and experience. Slowly but surely, British victories built upon each other and forced France into a war of attrition that played to Britain's strengths. With France's defeat, Britain truly did rule the waves, a position that would be maintained until the 20th century.